Did you know that Sean Bean has been oft on screen in over 24 films and television shows? Despite possessing the physical architecture of a rugged, indestructible warrior, he has somehow become Hollywood's premier tragic figure. Over the course of his career, he has met his end by getting his head taken off, crushed by a burning satellite dish, impaled on a boat anchor, and shot with arrows more times than we can count. But how did all of this come to be? Why did Sean Bean get chosen to represent the Man of Gondor in the Lord of the Rings trilogy? And what uniquely equips him to portray this role above almost any other actor in the industry? Well, in today's video, I'm going to answer those exact questions by diving deep into Sean Bean's journey to becoming Boromir. We will uncover how his unpretentious working-class grit perfectly grounded the fantasy epic, how his real-life phobias created cinematic magic on the snowy slopes of Caerphilus, and how he turned what could have been a standard action demise into a Shakespearean tragedy. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to Factor Fantasy, a place where we dive deep into the books and films to discuss all things Lord of the Rings and Tolkien. This is the 4th episode in my series exploring how our favorite actors became their iconic fictional characters in Middle-earth. If you haven't already seen my videos on Gandalf, Aragorn, and Gimli, be sure to check those out when you're done watching this video. And speaking of this video, today is all about Sean Bean. We're going to look at his early life, the chaotic realities of filming in New Zealand, and how his unique career trajectory perfectly equipped him to play the doomed Son of Gondor. So sit back, relax, grab a pint or some Old Toby, and enjoy this deep dive into the art of dying and Sean Bean's unforgettable performance as Boromir. To truly understand why casting directors continually select Sean Bean for characters destined for the grave, and why his deaths always seem to hit so incredibly hard, we have to first look at where he came from. You see, Sean Bean does not project the untouchable, polished heroism of traditional leading men. Instead, his screen presence is defined by a grounded, highly relatable humanity. And that palpable realism comes directly from his roots. Born Sean Mark Bean in April of 1959, he was raised in a modest council house in Handsworth, a fiercely working-class suburb of the heavily industrialized city of Sheffield. The environment of his youth was defined by pragmatic, blue-collar labor and the unyielding realities of the British steel industry. His father owned a local steel fabrication and welding firm, while his mother worked as a secretary for a business that manufactured steel strings. Growing up, Sean was not bred for the stage, he was bred for the steel mill. He left his local high school at the age of 16 with only 2 O-levels to his name, one in art and one in English, and immediately entered the workforce. Before he ever memorized a single line of dialogue, he took on a variety of odd, unglamorous jobs. He spent time selling cheese in a local supermarket, worked for the local council shoveling snow out of the streets, and eventually settled into a formal apprenticeship at his father's firm. He fully expected to inherit the family trade and spend the rest of his life as a welder and fabricator. This biographical baseline is critical to understanding his approach to acting. Bean's working-class upbringing forged a highly realistic, unpretentious approach to his craft. There is a distinct lack of vanity in his performances. He grew up in an environment where practical utility was valued far above theatricality, and that mindset has stayed with him. But how does a teenage welder transition into a global movie star? Well, it happened almost entirely by accident. While attending Rotherham College once a week to study the mechanics of welding, Sean impulsively peeked into an art and drama class. The creative spark was lit. Encouraged by tutors who recognized that he had talent that extended far beyond metalwork, he made the bold decision to pivot from his skilled trade and officially enroll in a performing arts course at the college. He started small, performing in college productions and at the local civic theater, but his raw talent was undeniable. In 1981, Sean auditioned for the highly prestigious Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, better known as RADA. Out of a staggering field of 11,000 applicants, Sean was one of only 30 young actors to win a scholarship. The transition from a Sheffield steel mill to the highly polished classical environment of RADA created a massive culture clash. Sean arrived in London resembling a working-class kid, suddenly thrust into an institution historically dominated by the British theatrical elite, people who spoke in pristine upper-class accents. But rather than shed his northern identity and conform, Sean fiercely retained his native Yorkshire accent and his unapologetic working-class ethos. This refusal to change who he was resulted in a truly unique actor, someone capable of performing high classical tragedy but with the unpolished grit of a street brawler. Throughout the late 1980s and 90s, he perfected the art of the relatable mortal man. He rose to massive prominence in the UK as the rugged Richard Sharp in the historical television series Sharp, and broke into Hollywood blockbusters, playing sympathetic antagonists like Sean Miller in Patriot Games and Alec Trevelyan in GoldenEye. By the time the late 90s rolled around, he had already perfected the mechanical and emotional art of dying on camera. Because his characters felt so intimately tied to the earth, audiences subconsciously recognized they were mortal and susceptible to the brutal whims of the world. And that specific, grounded vulnerability is exactly what a certain director in New Zealand was desperately looking for. When Peter Jackson and his writing partners Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens were undertaking the monumental task of casting The Lord of the Rings, the character of Boromir posed a highly specific problem. If you look at the composition of the Fellowship, it is filled with mythical, near-invincible beings. You have the immortal, graceful elegance of the elf Legolas, you have the ancient angelic power of Gandalf, you have the sturdy subterranean resilience of Gimli, and the destined royal stoicism of Aragorn, who himself is a man but blessed with a long life of the Dunedain. To balance this out and ground the narrative, Jackson desperately needed a flawed, deeply human counterweight. Boromir is the only standard, non-Dunedain mortal man in the core group. He represents the frailty, the fear, and the immense courage of humanity. Because of this, Jackson didn't want an actor who projected ethereal perfection. He needed someone who looked like they had been living in the trenches. He needed a seasoned warrior who could carry the visible exhaustion of a man trying to save a besieged nation. The casting search saw several prominent names tossed around. Action stars like Bruce Willis reportedly expressed interest, and the highly acclaimed Liam Neeson was offered the role but ultimately passed, not wanting to commit to a grueling 18-month shoot in New Zealand so soon after finishing Star Wars Episode 1. Plus, Neeson didn't want to set the precedent that he would play characters who got killed off in the first film of a trilogy. So, the casting directors eventually pivoted to looking for a seasoned British talent, and Sean Bean's name quickly rose to the top of that list. He didn't have a prior personal relationship with Peter Jackson, but his reputation preceded him. Jackson and the casting team knew his work from Sharp and his villainous turns in Hollywood blockbusters. They knew he possessed that specific, unpolished northern grit that they were searching for. When the offer came in, Bean was actually in the middle of a pretty busy schedule, but after reading the script and recognizing the sheer scale and ambition of the project, he eagerly accepted the role. But it takes a very specific type of actor to accept a role knowing that your character is essentially marked for death from the very first page. Boromir's tragic fate is baked into his literary DNA. Yet, Bean had no reservations about stepping into a role written to die. In fact, he embraced it pragmatically. He understood that playing flawed, complex men naturally leads to dramatic demises on screen. He even joked years later that sometimes he'd suggest the writers kill his characters off if he had scheduling conflicts with other projects. However, adapting Boromir for the screen required careful recalibration. In Tolkien's original text, Boromir sometimes can come across as slightly arrogant, argumentative, and untrustworthy right from his introduction at the Council of Elrond. If translated directly to the screen like that, his eventual death risked feeling like a mere plot mechanism, a necessary removal of an abrasive character, rather than a profoundly devastating loss. And this is where the magic of the scriptwriters, as well as Sean Bean's specific skill set, converged. Boyens and Walsh actively sought to elevate Boromir's arc into a quasi-Shakespearean tragedy. They framed the cinematic Boromir less as an arrogant usurper and more as a desperate, battle-fatigued son driven to madness by the impossible burden of defending his homeland. And Sean Bean knew exactly how to execute this. Drawing on his extensive history of playing sympathetic antagonists, he understood the golden rule of cinematic tragedy. To make a death resonate, the audience must first fall in love with the character. Knowing Boromir's dark fate, Bean deliberately infused his early scenes with a rough, older brother warmth. Just look at his physical interactions with the hobbits Merry and Pippin. He playfully teaches them swordplay and physically carries them across treacherous plains. He played these moments with deep, unironic sincerity. By deliberately framing Boromir as a warm protector, Bean ensured that his later violent attempt to take the ring from Frodo didn't feel like the inevitable action of a generic villain. Instead, it felt like a horrific, tragic violation of his true nature. It made the audience mourn the man he was, rather than cheer for the defeat of the man he temporarily became. And by the way, I must add that I know Tolkien perfectly wrote this character in the books. However, when adapting books to films, something like the character of Boromir can easily get lost in translation. Which is why I wanted to make such a point about how Sean Bean, Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens handled this character, having to condense his entire character arc into just one film instead of the long pages of Tolkien. So let me be clear that I'm not at all saying that Sean Bean or Peter Jackson or the writers improved what Tolkien wrote, but rather they took what they could and made the best out of the adaptation. Anyway, the point is that Sean Bean possessed the acting chops to pull off this immense emotional weight, and his Sheffield grit made him the perfect mortal anchor for the Fellowship. But actually surviving the grueling reality of the New Zealand shoot was going to require an entirely different kind of endurance. Stepping onto Peter Jackson's set in New Zealand was a radical departure from the polished sound stages of British television or traditional Hollywood blockbusters. Jackson was essentially running a massive, multi-million-dollar independent film. It was chaotic, muddy, and deeply reliant on practical, boots-on-the-ground filmmaking. And while Sean Bean's blue-collar work ethic made him a perfect fit for this environment, he harbored a very real, intensely personal vulnerability that was about to be severely tested. During the early 2000s, Sean Bean suffered from a crippling fear of flying. To cope with the unavoidable commercial flights required by his acting career, he would routinely grip the armrests in sheer terror, often needing a stiff drink before boarding just to survive the psychological ordeal. But filming The Lord of the Rings didn't just require commercial flights to New Zealand. It required fleets of tiny, nimble production helicopters to ferry the cast and crew up to remote, high-altitude locations in the New Zealand mountains. This fear came to a boiling point during the filming of the snowy Caradhras mountain sequences. On Bean's very first helicopter flight up to the mountain set, his co-stars Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd, who played Merry and Pippin, decided to pull a rather mischievous prank, much like their characters. They falsely informed their pilot, Alfie Spite, that Bean was a massive aviation enthusiast who loved extreme flying. Taking them at their word, the pilot proceeded to perform a series of terrifying aerial tricks, sudden steep drops, and sharp maneuvers over the jagged peaks. This experience terrified Sean Bean. When the chopper finally touched down at the snowy peak, a visibly shaken, pale Sean Bean turned to Peter Jackson and simply declared, "Sorry mate, no more helicopters, I'm done." And he kept his word. For the remainder of the remote mountain shoot, Bean adamantly refused to set foot on a chopper. Instead, he made a grueling decision. Every single day, Bean would wake up hours before the rest of the cast. He would go through wardrobe and makeup, strapping on his heavy, padded Boromir tunic, elements of chainmail, thick boots, his massive shield, and his broadsword. Fully geared up as the warrior Boromir, he would hike up a steep hill to reach an active ski lift. He would then ride the ski lift alone in the freezing cold, and then hike for another half-mile across treacherous, nearly vertical snowy terrain just to reach the camera setup. Peter Jackson vividly recalled flying up to the set in a comfortable, warm helicopter, looking down out the window and seeing Sean Bean scaling a rock face below like a tiny human fly. But this wasn't just a funny behind-the-scenes anecdote. It created accidental cinematic magic. That daily physical exhaustion deeply impacted his performance. Bean's real-life vulnerability and extreme physical depletion bled directly into Boromir's on-screen desperation. The heavy breathing, the flushed, wind-chapped face, the genuine fatigue, none of that was acted. It stripped away any lingering theatrical pretense and allowed Boromir's creeping despair and frustration with the quest to feel undeniably real. And the funny thing is that this isn't the only time practical problem-solving inadvertently created a brilliant character moment. Because one of Boromir's most famous lines in the movie comes from the Council of Elrond, and it was kind of an accident. The scene features the gathering of the leaders of Middle-earth, and it was heavily populated by veteran, classically trained actors projecting immense upright gravitas. people like Ian McKellen, John Rhys-Davies, and Hugo Weaving. But the script for Boromir's crucial monologue in this scene at the Council of Elrond was frantically rewritten by Jackson and his writing team the very night before filming commenced, which, by the way, was a common practice for the entire trilogy, according to the cast. Sometimes they'd be handed a new script in the middle of the night or that morning before filming. And that's exactly what happened to Sean Bean. He was handed a long, complex, fantasy-laden speech the morning he arrived on set. He had virtually no time to properly memorize the new, dense dialogue. Faced with this logistical nightmare, Bean didn't complain or demand more time. He opted for a highly practical, working-class solution. He requested a printout of the speech and used tape to stick the lines directly to his own knee. When it came time to deliver the now iconic line, "One does not simply walk into Mordor," Bean had to continually look down at his lap to read the script hidden on his leg. This utilitarian behind-the-scenes trick accidentally created his famous physical posture on camera. By lowering his head, avoiding eye contact, and rubbing his brow as he glanced down, Bean's body language heavily emphasized the crushing burden, the deep internal shame, and the impending doom that his character carried. Little did the audience know that he literally was looking at his knee for the words. While the other actors in the room performed with Shakespearean projection, sitting tall in their chairs, Bean's posture suggested a man who was already defeated by the grueling realities of war. It was a perfect marriage of working-class practicality and character-defining acting. And in a hilarious twist of fate, that posture of weary resignation not only anchored the scene perfectly, but permanently immortalized him in pop culture as the visual face of one of the internet's oldest and most recognizable memes. Through sheer grit, avoiding helicopters, and taping lines to his leg, Sean Bean had forged a deeply human character. But the true test of Boromir's legacy, and the sequence that would redefine Sean Bean's entire career, was waiting for him in the woods of Amon Hen. The climax of Boromir's arc is arguably the absolute apex of Sean Bean's expertise in cinematic mortality. Filmed near the Lake Peninsula of Closeburn, the massive woodland skirmish at Amon Hen required incredible physical endurance. During the sequence, Boromir attempts to redeem his earlier betrayal by desperately defending the hobbits from an overwhelming force of Uruk-hai. In pre-production, when planning the shot, Peter Jackson briefly considered using CGI for the sequence, using computer graphics to generate the arrows shot into Boromir. Thankfully, this idea didn't make it to actual production, and they opted for the practical effects that make Sean Bean's performance so realistic. Weta Workshop designed a specialized thick metal breastplate that Bean wore underneath his leather tunic. This allowed for the props department to stick arrows into his breastplate one by one, with Sean Bean providing the raw reactions. That way, he literally had arrows sticking out of his chest, and not just some green dots that would later be covered with CGI arrows. But it wasn't just the CGI that made this scene. It was Bean's highly specific acting choices that elevated the action sequence into a Shakespearean tragedy. When struck by the first arrow, Bean didn't flail wildly or scream melodramatically. His reaction was a subtle faltering of breath, a deep, shocked pause before he forced his failing body to swing his sword again. With each successive arrow, Bean allowed his physical frame to visibly diminish. When he finally drops to his knees, it signifies total physical and spiritual defeat. To ensure the death carried the necessary emotional weight, the dialogue required a massive overhaul. The night before shooting the emotional crescendo, Bean, Viggo Mortensen, Peter Jackson, and the other writers sat in a Queenstown hotel room. Over beers and a bottle of wine, they deeply reworked the final exchange of Aragorn and Boromir. Together, they created the lyrical dialogue that would act as Boromir's ultimate redemption. "I would have followed you, my brother, my captain, my king." When discussing his mental preparation for dying on camera, Sean Bean once stated an acting philosophy completely stripped of ego. He said, "You can't show off, you can't be vain or posing, because every time you die, it's a big moment." By stripping away all actorly vanity, Bean ensured the audience's focus remained entirely on the horrific reality of a strong man's life slowly fading away. But far beyond securing him future roles in other famous franchises, his time in Middle-earth left a permanent mark on the film industry itself. Before Bean's tenure as Boromir, the deaths of prominent actors in action or fantasy cinema were often brief, stylized sacrifices. Sean Bean fundamentally changed audience expectations. Through a complex synthesis of his unpretentious upbringing, his rigorous training, and a complete lack of vanity, he elevated the mechanical art of cinematic mortality into a profound exploration of human frailty. From the freezing slopes of Caerthras to the blood-stained steppes of Amon Hen, Sean Bean has proven time and time again that the most powerful thing an actor can be is mortal. So what do you think of Sean Bean's incredible journey? And who should I cover next in this series? Let me know your thoughts and suggestions in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this character deep dive, then please drop a like and subscribe, and check out my other 3 episodes in the playlist below. I want to give a massive shout out to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, RoboSteve, Drix, Andy, Maha, and the rest of my incredible Patreon and YouTube members who help make these videos possible every month. Other than that, have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.